analysts have sought to reiterate wider implications of the 30% U.S. tariffs that came into effect this month. The tariff regime is seen as undermining jobs, deepening inequality and placing millions at risk. A recent Oxford economics report warned that the impact of the current dispensation will reflect sharply in the next round of employment figures. This came after the second quarter labour force survey revealed this week that 140,000 more people are now jobless, bringing the total number to 8.4 million and the official unemployment rate to 33.2%. Economist at the Stellenbosch Business School, Nthabiseng Moleko, speaks to us now about the global trade tensions. Thank you so much for your time and patience. And like I indicated earlier, it's a sensitive time, but essentially, what is meant by the deepening inequality that is likely to come, as well as the undermining of jobs that the U.S. tariffs come with?
Very good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. Well, inequality is the reality that we have in this country in terms of income inequality, wage inequality. We also see access to assets and the disbursement of surpluses, whether it's budget surpluses and across the board profits. And we're seeing a weakening of these gains reaching the majority of the people. The result and the outcome of that is that we see very high levels of gaps between the rich and the poor, very high levels of gaps in the corporate sector you see in terms of profits gained and who shares the profits and the surpluses of those profits. Gaps pertaining to consumption then persist, household activity is compressed, and you see that continuum of inactivity in the economy across the board. I think when you look at what the tariffs are likely to bring on board, and we've had a lot of discussion on the impacts of the tariffs, I think we really need to look at the strategic thrust of what type of discussions are we holding as a country to ensure that the economic impact of these is not just mitigated, but the diversification of the economy and the unemployment crisis is dealt with while you're dealing with this conundrum. I think it holds an opportunity for policymakers, for decision makers to do something deliberate around manufacturing, to do something deliberate about finance made available to SMMEs, to do something deliberate about African Continental Free Trade Agreement and robustly offer trade finance opportunities for Africans and locals to participate in sending things to Rwanda, to DRC, to Guinea-Bissau, to Benin. How can I, as an entrepreneur, do that if I want to produce Coke, if I want to produce a table, if I want to produce, agricultural foodstuffs, toothpicks, anything? Yeah. And I think this is where opportunities lie. If we miss this and we focus on the negative unintended consequence and the direct impact of these tariffs, and we don't see the opportunity for Africans to rewire how they are doing their economies, to rewire the dependence, to rewire how we export our unprocessed mineral goods. Now we are feeling the brunt of relying on consumption from economies that may curb their demand. And so now what are we going to do? Let's do something. And we can do something if we employ the instruments and the necessary policy changes and support subsectors that are going to help us to deal with these economic insecurities and inequality that you asked me about.
The passion at which you are describing what needs to happen at this juncture is quite refreshing, and the practicality thereof must also be questioned. Are we then saying that South Africa should just abandon mission when it comes to the mitigating side of trying to barter with the likes of the US from a desperate position, and rather put more focus where intercontinental trade and localization is concerned?
You can't just abandon strategic trade negotiations. That would be to the detriment of industry, particularly the auto sector. That would be to the detriment of our citrus producers, to the wine farmers. It would be to the detriment of those workers that are in those subsectors. And it would be to the detriment of the households and the livelihoods of that entire value chain. So number one, we have got to continue strategic negotiations, facilitating those discussions to try and impede the type of negative and adverse effect the heightening of production costs will have, or the heightening of these prices on the outcomes for any South African producer that sells goods offshore. So it is an imperative strategic issue to continue to negotiate. I think what is more strategic is the way that African economies trade their basic goods, their economic structures, and the way that they understand the power that they have in the global space. You know, we like to position ourselves as beggars. We like to position ourselves as people that don't have authority and power in terms of resources. And yet we know mineral compositions that we have, the world cannot operate without them. But how are we leveraging those for our benefit? How are we setting up industrial complexes, new ones, right? New ones. The ones that we have had, the methods we have applied have not helped us, have not made us to be at the forefront in the last 30, 40 years. And since the democratization of most African economies, we have not seen the gains of democracy in Africa because economically speaking, we have not necessarily garnered success. So I think we have got to, when I say reconfigure the way we see ourselves, is we have got to start taking arm and authority over our economies. And we need to stop being at the helm of being told. For an example, I'll take a practical case.
Yeah.
Now the world is responding to a superpower, economically speaking, because they have great buying power. Now we are understanding that actually countries can protect their domestic local industries. This is something that people have always pronounced on. Yes, we know that it has issues around competition, inefficiencies. And economists will tell you that many countries start subsectors and industries from an uncompetitive perspective at the beginning. Then you gain efficiencies over years, you gain technology. There are therefore spillovers that come into a sector. But you will not start being first class without starting somewhere. So all I'm saying is that we've got to start somewhere as South Africans when we look at manufacturing. We've got to look at local manufacturing and small producers at a district level. These district development models we always talking about. Why are they not including manufacturing? Why are they only talking about halls, classroom, community, this? Where is the manufacturing? Where is the local industrial capability? Where is the finance mechanisms to ensure that at every district we reverse what we did in the last 30 years and in the colonial and in the apartheid period? But if you don't have deliberate instruments that are going to help us reverse that by producing, by not just consuming, but by producing, then we will start to see change. So I'm saying the conversation, we need to reconfigure the conversations we're having. We can complain all we want, but we have seen there are instruments countries use to position themselves. Why are Africans always at the brunt of these? Why our leaders don't understand or they don't employ these instruments for the benefit of Africans? We must ask those questions.
The time is now as a parting shot, and briefly so, there's also political posturing at play here. How important is it for South Africa to come out with its integrity intact when it deals with negotiating with the US in this regard, especially with the G20 presidency that it hands over to the US?
You're asking me politics.
Oh, yes.
I'm not a political person. What I can say is that from an economic perspective, Africans have to look at the best interest of African people. African leaders, and this, I can't talk to posturing and trade facilitation. They're probably better experts than me who can tell you how to negotiate when you're dealing with global superpowers. What I can say is African leaders need to, from an economic liberalization perspective and economic standing position, look at the interests of Africans. Can we look at our interests for a change? Can we focus on what will benefit us? Can we focus on what networks in terms of logistics, instead of taking our coal fast as we can out of the country, our steel as fast as we can, our platinum as fast out as we can as a country? Can we say, what is it that we need to do to process this into a good? What are the inputs required? Of course, it's a long-term strategy. What investment strategy do we deploy to attract capital? Yes, we are currently undergoing geopolitical tensions. There is a changing world order. The focus of our discussion is always on the negative. It's an opportunity for leaders to say, what must be done at an industrial level, I would say, SACU. We've got the African Continental Free Trade. We've got the AU. What discussions are happening at the AU on economic reconfiguration of Africa to develop and produce in the context of all these things that are happening? instead of trying to be friends with everyone, and I'm not saying let's be enemies, but why are we not friends with ourselves first and look at what's going to benefit the 465 million Africans in poverty that are not producers but consumers, that are on the back of deindustrialization, that are on the back of inequality, and that are, in terms of world trade, intra-Africa trade is the lowest, comparably speaking, globally. What are we doing about that? And I think that's the discussion. And I think if we need to open the discussion and say, what instruments do we deploy? If the ones we have haven't been working, but we've got to have a productive, active, economically participating working class of Africans that begin to look at this thing of development and the development model very differently from what we currently have.
Thank you so much for your insights. Economist at the Stellenbosch Business School, Nthabiseng Moleko, they're talking to us about the current discussions and dispensation, which include reaction to the US tariffs and the impact thereof on the South African economy.